Like many people, I have polarizing feelings towards The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. There are so many fantastic parts to the adventure of Skyloft that are hampered by poor design choices. As the years have gone by, my stance on Skyward Sword has softened considerably. I recognize that Nintendo was trying something different with the gameplay, something pretty advanced for the time it was released. And there are plenty of interesting mechanics that were expanded upon and/or reimagined later in The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Skyward Sword is so markedly an experimental game for Nintendo, and I can appreciate the risks it takes in design, even when those risks don't pan out. So, with the benefit of hindsight, Nintendo is taking another crack at this anomaly in the series with The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD. Like all remasters, Skyward Sword HD aims to improve upon the initial experience where possible, while preserving things that were great about the original. What has held up over time? What has been improved? What still doesn't work? And are there any new problems specific to the Nintendo Switch release? Let's find out. But first, please subscribe and click the bell to get updates whenever I publish new videos. I'll also have annotations at the end, including my dedicated Nintendo content playlist. Now let's dive in. This review is based on a physical, retail copy of the game for the Nintendo Switch. Let's start with the constants. Skyward Sword HD still follows the journey of Link from Skyloft as he searches for Zelda in the mysterious land beneath the clouds. As the first game in the Zelda timeline, Skyward Sword focuses on the origin of its characters and of Hyrule itself. It's also the only game in the series with overt romance between Link and Zelda besides the ending of Zelda 2. Their relationship is not as fun as the more upbeat interactions of Toon Link and Tetra, but it feels natural and comfortable. Skyward Sword's budding romance still reads well after all these years, and adds some much-needed color and subtext to the story. That's not to say there are no improvements made. You can now button mash through many of the long, bloviating dialogues, and even skip cutscenes entirely. There are significantly fewer conversation prompts to interrupt the flow of progression, and Fi mostly stays out of your way until you need her. All this greatly improves Skyward Sword's pacing and digestibility, and it's a lot less annoying overall, especially at the outset. Now I'm sure it goes without saying, but music has always been an integral part of the Zelda series. Not only have instruments been featured prominently since the first game, but arguably the most famous Zelda title is literally named for its time-traveling ocarina. Skyward Sword carried on this hallowed tradition as the first Zelda game with a fully orchestrated score. The result is music that is classic and timeless, as beautiful and entrancing today as it was 10 years ago. And that just about marks the end of what's remained unchanged. So let's take a look at what's been reworked. Of course, the original Skyward Sword's visuals were always going to need touching up, but the graphics have aged about as well as any Wii game can be expected. Skyward Sword's watercolor aesthetic is still gorgeous, and it's one of the few Wii games that is natively rendered in a 16:9 aspect ratio. Skyward Sword HD updates the visuals in a number of ways. There are the obvious changes like improved textures and the titular HD resolution. As good as the original game still looks, the remaster is how Skyward Sword was always meant to be rendered. Docked resolution is 1080p, handheld play is 720p, and there's a lot more detail in the fore and background as well as on the character models. By comparison, the Wii version ran in a widescreen 480p, so the Switch remaster's improvements are instantly recognizable. But there are a handful of more subtle changes as well. The Switch version has reduced object halo effects for Skyloft models as seen here. The menus and icons have been remade in high definition, of course, and the color range has been improved, which has the added benefit of removing a lot of artifacting present in the original game. The Wii version's visual artifacts were primarily caused by color dithering, which is the use of two adjacent colors to simulate a third color, as seen here. Since the remaster implements a broader native color palette, the Switch version abandons color dithering and subsequently reduces artifacting. I thought Skyward Sword HD implemented anti-aliasing from how much cleaner the image is over the original version, but it actually doesn't. The graphical clarity is a byproduct of the expanded chromatic space. I do wish Nintendo used some anti-aliasing as well, but to be honest, I didn't even really notice its absence in practice. Obviously, we have to do some comparisons, starting with the Wii version. This footage was actually captured on the Wii U, which automatically upscales Wii games into 1080p. Even considering the clarity issues and generally pixelated geometry, I think this still looks pretty good. Here's Nintendo Switch handheld. Instantly looks a lot better, but obviously the image is a bit soft due to the display medium. And let's take a look at docked footage. Again, I think this is the way Nintendo always wanted Skyward Sword to be visually presented. It really is a beautiful game. But by far, the biggest change is with the gameplay. First and foremost, Skyward Sword HD runs at a native 60 frames per second, and it's locked in at all times except the more hectic segments of Elden Volcano. Even these moments are minor, maybe dropping about 5 or so frames in the most chaotic areas. It just feels so much better moving around and fighting at 60 FPS. Combat feels more fluent as a direct result of the improved frame rate, in addition to the refined mechanical inputs. I did have a bit of trouble acclimating to the motion controls. Part of it is because Joy-Cons are markedly smaller than Wiimotes. But once I adjusted, I definitely noticed the Switch version's greater responsiveness. Plus, since there are 2 analog sticks on a pair of Joy-Cons, the right stick is used to control the camera, which feels much better than just swinging the camera around in the Wii version. The camera movement is admittedly pretty slow on its default speed, at least to me, so I had to change that in the settings. But in the end, I still don't prefer motion controls, so I opted to play with the remaster's button control scheme. The right analog stick controls the sword motions, and certain tilt combinations use special attacks. For example, right left and left right left each perform the spin attack. Button controls definitely felt better to me in the long run, but it's not perfect either. Some special attacks felt a bit clunky to perform, such as the front and backflip slash attacks, as well as the fatal blow, which uses the same input combination. Moreover, because the right stick defaults to sword controls, you have to hold the L button to control the camera. I really don't like this at all. I think the right stick should default to the camera, and the sword should be used by holding L, since you'll be exploring far more than fighting over the course of the game. This would also alleviate a secondary issue I had with the remaster. Holding the L button for long durations feels unnatural in general. I was so done with holding the L button during regular gameplay that I actually went into my Switch settings and swapped the button mappings for L and ZL, just for Skyward Sword. That definitely helped a lot, but it shouldn't be on the player to work around core functionality complaints within the game. Hopefully Nintendo addresses this with a future update. But that sentiment really captures my entire experience with this remaster. I like Skyward Sword HD. I like that the gameplay is flexible. If you love motion controls, the remaster is even better than the original. And if you hate motion controls, then there's an input scheme just for you. And I think the button controls are really quite brave on Nintendo's part. Barring the camera input complaints, the non-motion controls are really impressive. But that's exactly the problem. Neither style of gameplay is perfect, and I'm not sure they ever can be on a fundamental level due to the nature of the game's design. Much like the Wii release, everything that's great about Skyward Sword HD is weighed down by something else that is not, and its problems are rooted in the core tenets of Skyward Sword itself. I like Skyward Sword, so I was able to glean more positive experiences with this remaster, and there's definitely a lot of great content and significant improvements, but I recognize that not everyone liked the original. Ultimately, how much you enjoy Skyward Sword HD boils down to how much you're willing to put up with and maybe even overlook these foundational issues. Looking back, it's telling just how much Nintendo learned from Skyward Sword. I can appreciate how experimental it is and how innovative it tried to be. Several key elements carried over from Skyward Sword to Breath of the Wild, albeit in varying degrees of implementations. Some made the jump almost as is, such as the stamina meter. Some were removed or significantly reduced in scope, such as the motion controls. And some were further fleshed out and reimagined, specifically the fully open-world design. With the added advantage of hindsight, Nintendo has made great strides in polishing and improving Skyward Sword in every possible way. It looks better than ever, it plays better than ever, and all the parts that were great are still fantastic. But it's impossible to change the heart of the game without rebuilding the entire journey from the ground up. Skyward Sword's persistent issues are as much a part of its identity as its strengths, and nothing short of a complete remake will ever change that. But for what it's worth, I think the remaster is almost as good as it possibly can be, and for a lot of people, myself included, that's gonna be good enough. The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword HD on Nintendo Switch earns a 7 out of 10. Please subscribe, hit the bell, and check out my Nintendo playlist. Thanks!